Hey everyone, you're listening to the Audio Study Bible. My name is Jason Hart, and today I'm going to be reading through Jonah chapter 4 with comment. We've already looked at the first 3 chapters of Jonah. In Jonah chapter 1, we found Jonah on a ship sleeping because he was fleeing from God's command to go to Nineveh and was sailing to Tarshish. In Jonah chapter 2, we find Jonah in a fish praying because he had been cast out of the ship and swallowed up by a great fish. In chapter 3, we find Jonah in a city preaching because he had finally obeyed God's command and gone to the city of Nineveh to cry out to it what God told him. And in the middle of chapter 4, we're going to find Jonah on a hill pouting. Jonah is pouting because God did not destroy the city of Nineveh. So we pick it up now here in Jonah chapter 4, verse 1, reading from the ESV. But it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he was angry. What was it that displeased Jonah? It was the fact that God did not destroy the city of Nineveh. In fact, another way to translate this was that it was exceedingly evil to Jonah. If you remember, at the end of chapter 3, there was a play on words that as the city of Nineveh turned from their evil way, God turned from the evil that he was going to do. And the wordplay continues in verse 1 of chapter 4. To Jonah it was evil. Verse 2, and he prayed to the Lord and said, O Lord, is not this what I said when I was yet in my country? That is why I made haste to flee to Tarshish, for I knew that you were a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, and relenting from disaster. Therefore now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live. Verse 2 here is really a bombshell because this is the first time that Jonah is giving us his reason of why he did not want to go to the city of Nineveh. And it's because, evidently, he was afraid that this would happen. In fact, another way to translate this is what I was trying to prevent. And notice his theology about God is spot on. God was gracious. He knew that God was gracious and merciful and slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and relenting from disaster. But that is exactly why he didn't want to go to Nineveh, because he didn't want Nineveh to experience those attributes of God. And so this really is the point of the story to start paying attention here, because it's just shocking that this is the reason that Jonah did not want to go to Nineveh. In fact, he's so upset about it at the end of verse 3, it's better for me to die than to live. This is the first time here that Jonah is expressing his desire to die. This is in contrast to his desire to live in chapter 2. Verse 4, and the Lord said, do you do well to be angry? This is the first of 3 questions here that God is going to ask in this chapter. This question is left unanswered. We move on to verse 5. Jonah went out of the city and sat to the east of the city and made a booth for himself there. He sat under it in the shade till he should see what would become of the city. Now the Lord God appointed a plant and made it come up over Jonah, that it might be a shade over his head to save him from his discomfort. So Jonah was exceedingly glad because of the plant. Notice this is in contrast to verse 1. If you remember, Jonah had exceeding anger that an entire group of people had experienced God's salvation. But here he has exceeding joy over something as insignificant as a plant. And so this is designed to contrast and show us the absurdity here of Jonah's emotions. Verse 7, but when dawn came up the next day, God appointed a worm that attacked the plant so that it withered. When the sun rose, God appointed a scorching east wind, and the sun beat down on the head of Jonah so that he was faint, and he asked that he might die and said, it is better for me to die than to live. This is Jonah's second request, that he die. Notice the things here that God is appointing in chapter 4. He appointed the plant in verse 6, the worm in verse 7, the wind in verse 8. Remember, he also appointed the fish back in verse 17 of chapter 1. And the whole idea here is that God is behind all this. He's orchestrating all of this. He is in control. Verse 9, but God said to Jonah, do you do well to be angry for the plant? This is the second question that God asks here. Remember the first question, he just said, do you do well to be angry? And in that instance, he was talking about Jonah's anger that Nineveh was not destroyed. Here, he's saying, do you do well to be angry that the plant was destroyed. And Jonah responds here, verse 9, and he said, yes, I do well to be angry, angry enough to die. And this is Jonah's third wish, that he would die. Verse 10, and the Lord said, you pity the plant for which you did not labor, nor did you make it grow, which came into being in a night and perished in a night. And should not I pity Nineveh, that great city in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know their right hand from their left, and also much cattle? It's hard to notice here, but this book or this verse ends with a question. There's so much else going on. It talks about 120,000 persons and cattle, but the book of Jonah ends with a question. This is the third question here that God asks Jonah. And the question is, should not I pity Nineveh? This statement here about the 120,000 persons not knowing the right hand from the left, there's some debate about this. Is this in a moral sense, like they don't know right from wrong, or is this an age sense, like there's 120,000 young children who don't know the right hand from their left? It's not exactly clear. And then there's a little bit of humor here because it says, not only are there these people, but there's also much cattle. And so the idea here is, look, if you won't even pity them for the people, will you at least pity them for the cattle? And that's it. The book of Jonah ends. It ends with a question from God to Jonah, should not I pity Nineveh? Since this question here is unanswered, I think it's also fair to say that this question is extended to us as the reader, for us as we ponder and reflect, what is it that we have read here in the book of Jonah? And as we try to wrap our minds around the message of the book of Jonah, I think it's worth pausing and reflecting on the purpose of Jonah, which is that the book of Jonah invites the reader to reflect on the character of God and on our own attitude towards the enemies of God. And as we reflect on our own attitude towards the enemies of God, I think it's worth pausing and reflecting on Jonah's attitude towards the enemies of God. I think it's worth trying to reflect on the question, why did Jonah want Nineveh to be destroyed? Or perhaps more precisely, why was Jonah upset that Nineveh wasn't destroyed? Now, the Net Bible offers three answers for this. First of all, Jonah was a loyal nationalist, and he would have despised non-Israelites. And kind of the idea here is we're better off without them. Like, it's kind of, we have the kingdom, we have the revelation of God, we're doing okay. Like, don't bring them into the equation. We're better off without them. Secondly, is that Jonah viewed that as idolaters, the city of Nineveh would have forfeited their right to the mercy of God. You remember what he said in verse 8 of chapter 2, those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. And so, in other words, the idea here is they're getting what's coming to them. Like, I'm glad I've got God's salvation. I'm glad that I'm forgiven. But as for everybody else, they're getting what's coming to them. And finally, number 3, if Nineveh had been destroyed, this would have prevented Assyria, or at least partially prevented Assyria from judging Israel, as had been prophesied by Amos and Hosea. And kind of the root idea here, and I am simplifying it just a little bit, but the root idea here is, if they succeed, I might fail. And so Jonah here is expressing pride. I'm better off without him. He's expressing judgment. They're getting what's coming to him. And he's expressing fear. If they succeed, I might fail. Like, in other words, I'm afraid that my success is going to be hindered by their success. And I don't think that it's so much important that we can spot these attitudes in the current culture, American climate, although I think that you can. I think it's more important to ask the Holy Spirit to reveal to you the ways in which you are harboring these attitudes in your own heart. What is the group of people or the person or group of persons that in your mind, your default reaction is, I'm better off without them, they're getting what's coming to them, and I'm afraid that if they succeed, I might fail. Secondly, then, we reflect, not only have we reflected on our own attitude towards the enemies of God, but we also pause and reflect on the character of God. What is God like? And really, the book of Jonah is a beautiful display of the character of God, because God has shown grace and mercy to every single character that we have met here in the book of Jonah. In chapter 1, he demonstrated grace and mercy to the pagan sailors in saving them from the storm and presumably accepting their sacrifice and vows. In chapter 2, God demonstrated grace and mercy to Jonah by saving him from the depths of the sea and saving him from the belly of the great fish. God then in chapter 3 obviously extended grace and mercy to the city of Nineveh. But then I also think you can argue that God is showing grace and mercy to Jonah in chapter 4. Bear in mind, God could have come down on Jonah with judgment and destruction and condemnation because of Jonah's terrible attitude, but he didn't. He patiently and methodically used a plant and a worm and the sun and an east wind as an object lesson to teach Jonah the error of his ways and invite Jonah to have a change of heart. That was God's final question to Jonah: should not I pity Nineveh? And so we have here God continuing to express grace and mercy to Jonah, even despite Jonah's bad attitude. And so it's here that I, as the reader, am caught off guard a little bit, because I've been extremely critical and harsh towards Jonah as we've walked through this book. But I think that it's fair to say that if I, as the reader, still am harboring in my heart judgment and condemnation against Jonah, then perhaps I've completely missed the entire point of the book of Jonah. Just as God posed to Jonah the question, should not I pity Nineveh, I think it's fair to extend that to the reader of, should not I pity Jonah? Have I completely missed the point of the book? Have I completely missed the answer to the question of what is God like? Because again and again, the book is showing us that God is gracious and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and relenting from disaster. That is what God is like. And that's the book of Jonah.